Today's sermon by Judy Butler is titled Sheroes, Then. Judy Butler is a longtime UU and has been a member of UUCC for over 10 years. When her husband wanted to move here many years ago, Judy refused to move unless there was a UU church. During one of our many summer stays, she attended the first meeting in Cambria to form a UU church. She then announced to her husband, "Now we can move." And they did. Please welcome Judy Butler. Little sound effect there.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Morning, thank you. Excuse my voice today. Good morning. Today I want to talk to you about a few of my sheroes. That is, women heroes. My talk was originally scheduled for International Women's Day, but I got rescheduled. We heard about a lovely rabbi. So let's just pretend we are celebrating women today. That might not be a bad idea. Let's do that every day. You are probably familiar with the women I have chosen from the past, and in 2 weeks we will discuss my current sheroes. These particular women today are all from the 30s during the Depression. I feel a special affinity for women of that time, as I often think of my mother and what she might have accomplished if she hadn't felt so hemmed in by the social mores of the time. I've always felt my mother would have been a CEO of a company if she'd been born 50 years later. I will tell you that I searched high and low through their biographies to try and find a UU connection, but no luck. However, I think in the past I have talked about plenty of UU women. So let's just celebrate these women who to me also represent UU values, and especially the second principle, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. The first woman I want to talk about is Eleanor Roosevelt. To me, she was a very interesting woman. Her advocacy and unique legacy are often overlooked, especially when radical women who changed our country are discussed. In 1914, the FBI even began tracking her because of her work with liberal groups. Her file eventually grew to over 3,000 pages. Her background made her commitment to social justice all the more surprising. She overcame her class background that was especially notorious for anti-Semitism and anti-Catholicism. And she went on to champion the underdogs in our society. She drove FDR, her husband, to distraction by always pestering him to take care of the little nobodies who haven't any influence. And in doing that, she became the White House champion of young people, African Americans, sharecroppers, and the poor. Each day, her memos piled up on his desk. Sometimes he was irritated by her constant prodding. Probably more than sometimes. One day she wanted something done about segregated toilets at the Atlanta post office, and he just wanted her to pay attention to domestic matters, saying he'd already eaten chicken 6 times this week. She became her husband's eyes and ears, since his disability made it difficult for him to travel. She was called the busybody, and worse, by some newspapers who thought her travels to meet with and question troublesome situations were not any of her business. I have to admire her courage. I remember my father always disparaging her. Excuse me. He was a rock-ribbed New England Republican, and uppity women especially annoyed him. And then years later he got me. So, I think it's called karma. She really enjoyed her voice during the New Deal. She visited miners living in hovels. She got the government to purchase an Appalachian estate and made it into a community where miners' families would live in prefab homes that cost $2,000. One of my favorite things she was responsible for was the pack horse librarians in the hollows of Kentucky. These women rode out at the crack of dawn, summer and winter, and rode for miles up into the mountains of Kentucky to bring books to isolated cabins. For some mountain dwellers, it was the only time they ever saw a book. Little children learned to read, and adults gained knowledge. Eleanor traveled 50,000 miles during FDR's first term. She journeyed to rural black communities, Indian reservations, poor white areas, etc. And it have to be noted, it also got her out of FDR's hair. Her voice was amplified further by the war when she was very vocal about continuing the New Deal policies to rebuild the economy while we were battling overseas. She also visited with servicemen and supported the women's roles in the war effort here at home in the U.S. She was very opposed to the internment of Japanese Americans. She was the author of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. Eleanor would hold several positions at the United Nations, and she used each appointment to advance her position on human rights, advocating for the respect and dignity of all individuals, regardless of sex, color, or religious belief. These were extraordinary times for women leaders, and she stood out for her fearlessness and tirelessness. One of her crowning achievements was authoring the Declaration of Human Rights, a document that is still active and serves as part of defining the core mission for the United Nations. Her granddaughter said, "What she taught us was that while each one is precious, all are valuable, all are to be honored, and all are to be respected." My next Shero is another woman from the Depression and FDR's administration. It is Frances Perkins. I'm especially drawn to Frances Perkins as she was the first woman to serve in a president's cabinet and was the first woman to be selected Secretary of Labor. As I was many times the only woman in meetings at work, I know how hard it is to be heard. And to be the first woman in the cabinet had to be daunting. Can you guess who pushed for her to be secretary? Yep, Eleanor. Frances was the principal architect of the New Deal, credited with formulating policies to shore up the national economy, following the nation's most serious economic crisis and helping to create the modern middle class. She was, in every respect, a self-made woman who rose from humble New England origins to become America's leading advocate for industrial safety and workers' rights. I'm hoping that you have a picture of her up, because I love these quotes from her. "The people are what matter to government, and a government should aim to give all the people under its jurisdiction the best possible life. And I promise to use what brains I have to meet problems with intelligence and courage." And I really like this one. "Being a woman has only bothered me climbing trees." She said, "From the time I was in college, I was horrified at the work that many women and children had to do in factories. There was absolutely no effective law that regulated the number of hours they were permitted to work. There were no provisions which guarded their health, nor adequately looked after their compensation in case of injury. Those things seemed very wrong. I was young and was inspired with the idea of reforming, or at least doing what I could to help change those abuses." It was said that she had caught a bad case of social conscience, so she decided to devote herself to helping the less fortunate. On March 25th, 1911, she was having lunch with friends in New York City's Washington Square when the group heard fire engines. Running to the scene of the fire, she witnessed in horror as 47 workers, mostly young women, jumped from the 8th and 9th floor of the building to their deaths on the street below. In all, 146 died as flames engulfed the upper 3 stories of the building. The fire at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was, she later proclaimed, the day the New Deal was born. In response to the fire, a Citizens Committee on Safety was established to recommend practices to prevent a further tragedy in the city's factories. While working on this committee, she pushed through the 54-hour law for working women in the New York legislature. The opposition believed if women only worked 54 hours, they would use the other hours for immoral purposes.
Yikes.
FDR picked her for Secretary of Labor as he felt her gender wouldn't hurt now that women had the vote. She had known FDR longer than anyone in the cabinet, 23 years. In the midst of the Depression, 1934, she turned her attention to solving some of the larger of society's problems, including unemployment and care for the aging. She nagged the president to get them started. Poor FDR. Not only did he have Eleanor nagging him, but now he had Frances nagging him. Finally, FDR gave her the nod. With joblessness rampant, she decided to go for unemployment insurance first. Then they began considering for more sweeping ideas such as old age pensions, and so began Social Security. She fought with FDR and for him in getting these social programs instigated, as he waffled due to the political aspects of the programs. By 1936, she could report that 1 million people were receiving benefits. Nearly 750,000 were old people. 184,000 were dependent children, and 18,000 were blind. Widowed mothers were not having to place their children in orphanages in order for them to be fed. One of her biggest disappointments, and mine, was that she was never able to institute a national health care system. She had been described as FDR's conscience. However, in one lingering black mark against his administration, she didn't prevail. As Secretary of Labor, the Immigration Service fell under her department. During the 1930s, when Hitler was beginning his attacks on the Jewish population in Germany, she worked tirelessly to change the quotas established for immigrating and to get bylaws changed to admit the thousands of Jews from Europe who were attempting to flee their countries. FDR's concern was that the country was at 30% unemployment, but for once, even Francis couldn't change his mind. She spent 12 years as labor secretary, doing a tremendous amount of good for this country while coping with a husband with mental illness who ended up having to be institutionalized. It is a great irony that she is now virtually unknown. Factory and office occupancy codes, fire escapes, and other fire prevention mechanisms are her legacy. About 44 million people collect Social Security checks each month. Millions receive unemployment and workers' compensation or the minimum wage. Others get to go home after an 8-hour workday because of the Fair Labor Standards Act. But very few know the name of the woman responsible for the benefits. She's definitely one of my sheroes. I had another person on this list of sheroes, but ended up having to take her off after I delved deeper into her past. Sometimes your sheroes turn out to have clay feet, I have found. And such as finding out how Margaret Sanger, who was the big birth control advocate at the turn of the century, had always been a hero of mine, but as I started researching, I discovered she was also very big on keeping the race pure and on eugenics. When I got to that, she lost her Shero status for me, so I turned to another woman I have long admired, Dorothea Lange. Well, here we have another woman of the Depression. Dorothea Lange, I am sure you're familiar with her photographs of migrants during the Depression. Her most famous one was taken down the road in Nipomo, in a tent city. It is called Migrant Mother. Dorothea Margareta Nutzhorn was born in Hoboken, New Jersey in 1895 to second-generation German immigrants. She grew up on Manhattan's Lower East Side. She dropped her middle name and assumed her mother's maiden name after her father abandoned the family when she was 12 years old, which was one of two traumatic events early in her life. The other trauma was her contracting polio at age 7, which left her with a weakened right leg and a permanent limp. It formed me, guided me, instructed me, helped me, and humiliated me, she once said of her altered gait. I've never gotten over it, and I am aware of the force and power of it. She studied photography at Columbia University in New York City, and in 1918, she decided to travel around the world, earning money as she went by selling her photographs. Her money ran out by the time she got to San Francisco, and she became a portrait photographer there. But at the beginning of the Depression, she was hired by the Farm Security Administration, where she documented the painful economic and environmental crises of the 1930s and 40s across the American West. Across her body of work, there are intimate glimpses of Great Depression breadlines, Japanese American internment camps during World War II, and migrant farm workers. At the time she was hired, the government was convinced that the masses of migrants headed into California were coming from Mexico. When Dorothea started photographing them, she realized that the license plates were from Texas, Arkansas, and Oklahoma. By providing her photographs, she convinced the government that this westward migration was internal U.S. From farm fields harvested by migrant workers devastated during the Dust Bowl to internment camps crowded with Japanese Americans during World War II, Dorothea maintained an affinity for the walking wounded, the people she saw struggling through hard times. Her access to the inner lives of these struggling Americans was the result of patience and careful consideration of the people she photographed. Her method of work was often to just saunter up to the people and look around, and then when she saw something she wanted to photograph, to quietly take her camera, look at it, and if she saw that they objected, she would close it up and not take the photograph, or perhaps she would wait until they were used to her. Lange worked tirelessly from the 1910s to her death in 1965 as a profoundly sensitive portrait photographer and one of the most influential documentarians of the early and mid-20th century. The government withheld her pictures of the Japanese internment camps from the public during World War II, when they were obviously not anxious to publicize the roundups, internments, and resettlement activities. In February of this year, a retrospective of her work was held at the New York Museum of Modern Art, including some of the photographs of the internment camps during the war. And while we're on the subject of Sheroes, I've noticed a trend lately. I'm finding more and more books are being written about women whose heroic activities had been lost for generations, such as the night witches, those Russian women pilots who flew plywood and linen glider-type planes and bombed the invading Germans at night. Night witches is the name the Germans gave to these women. Stories of British women who were parachuted into France during the occupation to be spies, and most were never heard from again. And there's Dr. Lisa Meitner, that woman, the woman that discovered nuclear fission and had been erased from history. And Rosalind Franklin, who developed the X-ray diffraction analysis of DNA that Watson and Crick used. The human computers, who allowed the US space program to be a success. And my favorites, the Packhorse librarians I've already mentioned, who spread literacy and books through Appalachia during the Depression. Even though I'm a pretty voracious reader, I had never heard any of these stories when I was growing up and was searching for female role models. It is as if a spigot has finally been turned on, and these women are being pulled from the dark pages of history. That is why in 2 weeks, we will meet here again, and I will talk about some younger heroes who hopefully have a little easier time of being heroes, Sheroes, today. Thank you.